the VIA Green Line. And if you're unfamiliar with this, I suspect everyone is, but the VIA Green Line is the new advanced rapid transit line that VIA wants to roll out. So an advanced bus line that would predominantly go on along San Pedro Avenue, north to south in San Antonio. And we find very little opposition to the Green Line and a majority in support of the Green Line's construction. Lastly, building off of some of the findings that we had from our Bexar County voter panel study from November, we dig into attitudes and views towards crime and safety in this top issue on voters' minds in the November election, ahead of the November election. And so we dig into that a little bit more, and I'll describe some of the findings from those questions as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, this poll was in the field from February 17th through the 20th. The sample size was 683 likely voters. And the margin of error for the poll was 3.8%. A couple things I will note. All respondents were registered voters living in San Antonio. It was a likely voter poll, and the sample was weighted on both past participation in San Antonio mayoral elections, as well as self-reported likelihood of voting in the May 2025 election. Individuals who indicated they were not likely to vote at all in the May 2025 municipal elections were disqualified from the study. And I can go into more details about the sampling methodology and the different steps we take to produce a sample if that's desirable. We've got some extra slides at the end where I can talk about all of that. Okay, so jumping into the mayor's race, we asked about all 27 mayoral candidates. I'm sorry? We asked about all 27 mayoral candidates, and we randomized the order in which their names appeared in the study. Again, this was done before the ballot order was officially announced. And so, again, the modal response was people don't know how they were going to vote in this election, 35.2%. 20.5% were unfamiliar with any of the candidates. And 1% said they would vote for someone else. So apparently 27 wasn't enough for them. Someone else added.
Can we stop here for a minute and ask Garrett if he could please mute your mic while Dr. Juhay is speaking? Thank you.
My apologies. Didn't realize it was on.
No problem. And 19 of the 27 candidates drew less than 1% of the less than 1% support, right? So we see evidence of a slim field, or at least a slim percentage of the field drawing any support whatsoever. So overall, this is what it looks like. We see, most candidates not drawing any support. So this figure only includes candidates who drew any support in our poll. So folks that didn't draw any support whatsoever in the poll, we excluded from the figure. We do see some evidence towards the top of a small group sort of breaking away that is attracting at least 3% or more. So if we zoom in on that group a little bit, we'll see Gina Ortiz Jones on top with 9.3%. John Courage behind Ortiz Jones with 7.9%. Manny Pelaez pulling in 5.5%. Melissa Cabello Havrda with 3.9%. Beto Altamirano with 3.6%. Adriana Rocha Garcia with 3.3%, and Clayton Perry with 3.2%. So we've been calling this group the group of seven just because they are polling over 3%, and for another reason, which I'll talk about now. When we want to make some sense of these leads, whether or not they're significant or not, I'll note that this sort of common approach of doubling the margin of error for the poll and
If you're
seeing if
having a bad day, she always lifts you up. Awesome. So it's great to celebrate Mardi Gras with her. She's
okay,
originally from New Orleans, but I'm so glad she is.
there we
Sorry
go.
about that. Again, folks, would you please mute your mics? Thank you.
No problem. Mardi Gras is more exciting than this. So the so the doubling the margin of error for the poll is not appropriate in this case. And that's because the margin of error increases with proportion size. And so when you've got a race like this, when you have more than one candidate and no candidate is close to 50%, you got to calculate separate margins of error for each comparison you're making, right? So if you want to compare two candidates, you calculate a separate margin of error to know if that lead is significant or not. And so we include the formula we use to do that in the survey brief. If you're curious, the results of these analyses is that all 7 candidates with 3% or more have a statistically significant lead over the rest of the field. Gina Ortiz-Jones' 1.4 point lead over John Courage is not significant, but her 3.8 point lead over Manny Pelaez is significant. John Courage's 2.4 point lead over Pelaez is not significant, but his lead over the rest of the field is significant. Okay, turning to the local initiatives now. The first one we'll start with is Project Marvel. We asked a couple different questions about Project Marvel, as I mentioned at the outset. In the first one, we provided folks with just a little bit of background about Project Marvel, what it would entail in Hemisphere, etc. And we asked them if they think city and county should move forward with Project Marvel. And we said city and county, because even though Project Marvel is largely a city initiative, is being led by the city, the county cooperation is essential. The project's not happening without county approval. And, we're seeing increasing evidence of, the county involvement in it. Some county buildings are going to potentially be part of Project Marvel as well. And so we see overall, however, tepid support for Project Marvel. 41% of voters think that they should move forward with Project Marvel. 36% say no. 3% had no opinion, and about 1 in 5 and 20% said they were not sure. So our second question about Project Marvel was about the use of the county venue tax to at least partially fund part of a new Spurs arena. And we provided voters just a little bit of background about what that county venue tax is, a very brief one, and asked them if they would vote in favor of this. And this is likely actually going to be something voters will be voting on in the upcoming November election. And we see that 42% of voters would vote in favor of using the county venue tax to fund the Spurs Arena in part. 41% say no. 2% have no opinion, and 15% said they aren't sure. We also followed up on something we had been asking about in 2024, which was support for a plan to build a new San Antonio Missions minor league baseball team stadium in downtown San Antonio. We last asked about this in September of 2024. And although the two samples here by design are very, very different, the September 24 sample was meant to resemble a presidential electorate, whereas the sample for this study was meant to resemble a local municipal electorate. The levels of support were almost identical. We had a 41% said they were in favor of having the Spurs, rather the Mission Stadium built. 35% were not in favor. 4% had no opinion on this, and 20% were unsure. Again, some remarkable stability here from what we saw in our September poll. I'd also note that these numbers are also almost identical to support for Project Marvel that I just went over a couple of minutes ago. And so, we're seeing some consistency here with the voters' attitudes towards the development of new sports arenas and stadiums. Okay. The last thing we asked about was the local initiative we asked about was the Via Green Line. And again, this is new advanced rapid transit, that is bus rapid transit line that would run from north to south of San Antonio, largely along San Pedro Ave. We provided voters a little bit of background about the Green Line project. This is probably our longest question, just because we suspected people weren't overly familiar with it. We provided some pros and cons of it, including concerns among neighbors or folks in the neighborhoods near San Pedro Ave about traffic. We see overall a significant amount of support, or at least a significant lack of opposition to the Green Line project. 50% were in support of construction. 25% of voters did not support construction, which is not remarkably high. 3% had no opinion on it, and 22% said they aren't sure. So you can make the case that of the various local initiatives we asked about, the Green Line, it could be the most popular of them all. Okay. All right. So I mentioned at the outset that our Bexar County voter pilot study, which we conducted in November, and we released the results in early February, or at least a full report from that study in early February. In that study, we found that the top local concern or local issue among voters was crime. And for context, it was about 15%, right? Voters had a lot of issues to select from. So it wasn't like this was an overwhelming majority, but nonetheless, 15% cited crime, and that was the most that any issue attracted. And so we wanted to dig into crime and safety perspectives in the city a little bit more. And so we asked voters if they or anyone in their household had been a victim of a crime within the last 12 months. And we provide some examples of different crimes. We see 14% said yes, 85% said no, and 1% said they were not sure. Additionally, we asked voters about how safe they feel in their neighborhoods at two different times of day. So we asked them how safe they feel in their neighborhoods during the day, and how safe they feel in their neighborhood at night. And we see some pretty significant differences between the two. 93% of voters say they feel very safe or somewhat safe in their neighborhood during the day. Very few, a very small proportion, say they feel somewhat safe or very unsafe. But it's a different story when we look at night. Only 78% of voters say they feel safe or at least somewhat safe or very safe in their neighborhood at night. And the proportion that feel very safe, right, is pretty low, especially compared to what voters say during the day. And we see more people reporting that they feel unsafe during in their neighborhood during the night. 10% said somewhat unsafe. About 2% said very unsafe. Okay, the last set of questions that we included in the poll have to do with attitudes towards different levels of government. And if you've seen any of our previous polls, this has been something we've been consistently doing, just asking voters about how much they trust different levels of government, approval numbers for public officials at different levels of government, and the direction they think the city, state, and country are moving in. So we'll start with the latter question. A majority of folks in San Antonio think that the city is going in the right direction. Right? 50% said San Antonio is moving in the right direction. Only 25% said wrong direction. It's a much different story for the state and the country. And it's pretty similar. 30%, only 30% think the state is going in the right direction. Only 29% think the country is going in the right direction. And we see majorities think that both the state and the country are going in the wrong direction. And these numbers are pretty similar to what we've previously seen. We also asked voters about whether or not they trust the government to do what is right. And so when it comes to the local government, the city of San Antonio government, we see a majority think that the city of San Antonio can be trusted to do what is right most of the time, or just about always, 55%. Only 7% say never. Again, different story when we look at the state and federal government. Only 27% think that state of Texas can be trusted to do what is right most of the time, or just about always. And only 14% say the same thing about the federal government. And we see that the number of people that think that you can never trust the state of Texas or the federal government to do the right thing are pretty high. 24% say that about the state. 31% say that about the federal government. So that's quite the difference between the federal government and the city government when it comes to political trust. All right, finally, the last item I'll talk about here is approval of public officials. This is also something that we've been asking about for some time. We asked about Mayor Ron Nuremberg, Bexar County Judge Peter Sakai, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, and President Donald Trump. We see, as we've seen in our previous polls, good approval numbers for Ron Nuremberg. 58% strongly approve or somewhat approve of the job he's doing. Not too many people disapprove. Judge Sakai also has decent approval numbers. 46% approve or somewhat approve of the job he's doing. And the number of people who disapprove of the job he's doing is pretty small. I'll note that there's still relatively high unfamiliarity with Judge Sakai, or people who aren't sure about it. But this is a lot lower than what we saw in our previous polls. And there might be a couple reasons for that. One, again, is that this electorate, or rather this sample, is meant to look like a local electorate, which is probably going to be more familiar with Judge Sakai than the presidential electorate in the city. And the other factor is that Judge Sakai has now been in office longer. He has taken some positions in some high-profile issues, such as Project Marvel, so he's been in the news more, and so that might be contributing to more familiarity with him as well. When it comes to the governor and the president, we see very low approval numbers. We switched out presidents since the last time we asked about this question, but the low approval is still there. Pretty similar numbers for both Abbott and Trump. Only 28% strongly approve or somewhat approve of the job Greg Abbott is doing. And same thing, 28% somewhat approve or strongly approve of the job Donald Trump is doing. And almost the same amount of people are somewhat or strongly disapprove of the job they're doing. And we see majorities here. 60% disapprove of Greg Abbott, and 62% disapprove of Donald Trump. Okay. And with that, I will throw it. Oh, before I forget, we do plan to do a second municipal election poll this spring. The exact date to be determined, but we'll be ahead of early voting beginning in April, ahead of the May election. And we're also we're going to go out on a limb and assume that there's going to be a runoff election for the mayor's race. Just a hunch that no one is going to get to 50%. It's possible, right? It's a very fluid race, but assuming that no one gets to 50%, we will conduct a runoff election poll as well. And now, with that, I will throw it back to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gervais. All right, if you have questions for Dr. Gervais, if you'll just click the little raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go through these in order to try to give you all a chance to ask what you'd like. I know there's a lot here to unpack. While you're queuing up there, we'll just remind you again that this is being recorded. So if you have questions or need to come back to the original, feel free to do so. And our public affairs team is available if you have any other follow-up that you would like to ask. So are there questions? There's a lot there. All right, Garrett, why don't you kick us off?
There we go. I think I got the mic on this time properly.
There you go.
In any case, I want to go to the mayor's poll first of all. So it seems that if you're just looking at the order of candidates, that there is a clear leader, but you've got more than half of the likely voters have no idea. So I guess how useful is this poll for really measuring the likelihood of a campaign, considering there's so much uncertainty or general ignorance of the mayor's race?
Well, I think it allows us to gauge the state of the race, right? Which is that it's certainly very fluid. We've got a majority that are undecided. There's certainly no guarantee that group of seven continues to be the leaders. I mean, it's very possible someone outside of that group of seven surges, right? Just has, gets their name out there, successfully campaigns, or gets a big endorsement and stuff. So it's not set in stone by any means. But I think the poll tells us where we stand right now, which is, not a lot of voters really are familiar with the candidates enough to, say, well, I'm voting for this person now, right? Or really thinking a lot about the mayor's race, right? They think they've thought about this. We asked them, actually. This is something that we didn't include in this presentation, but we asked them how much they thought they've given to the mayor's race, and most people say I've thought about it, but they're still not familiar enough with the candidates to make a commitment. It's still anyone's race, and I think that other folks can break in, and we imagine things will change. Polls like this in a nonpartisan local election truly are sort of snapshots of moments in time. We shouldn't necessarily call them predictions, but we should say that they let us know about the state of a race at a certain point in time, even though that state can change, and we expect it will change.
Just so, can you kind of characterize what you see the state of this race is at this time, considering the two biggest responses are I don't know, or I'm not familiar with any of the candidates.
Wide open. I would say that the race is wide open. There's no one running away with it. There's lots of people undecided. So I mean, that's, I think, an apt description.
All right. Thank you, Garrett. Matt Roy, question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the Project Marvel aspect of this. You referenced a little bit when talking about the mayoral race, how significant, statistically significant those numbers were, whether they were or were not referring to other candidates. How statistically significant are the ones that we're talking about when it comes to Project Marvel, when they're so close, whether it's 40%, 41%, or 41%, 36% in favor or not in favor? Are those significant numbers with this kind of sample size?
No, it's not significant. No.
Why is that? Is it just because of the sample size, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, almost by definition, you increase your sample size, then your margin of error will decrease. Yeah. But it's also because it's pretty close when we're talking about the numbers for and against, and so, I mean, we could ask 3,000 people, and maybe, we can get that margin of error to shrink dramatically or significantly. So, and we can say, okay, we got a result that's significant here, right? But if it's 3 or 4 point difference, we still say, well, it's pretty close in terms of support in opposition.
Do you expect those numbers to change since this will probably be on the November ballot or even next May's ballot and not this May's ballot? Do you expect those numbers to change pretty significantly?
They could, absolutely. I mean, it really depends a lot on what voters learn and come to understand about the Project Marvel project, and as many of you all have reported on, there's other funding mechanisms for various aspects of the project that are being considered and thrown out there, and so Project Marvel is very fluid as well, and what it ultimately looks like and what voters, ultimately are asked to think about, I think, remains to be seen, right? I mean, that with the county venue tax, right? It might be that voters who are also might be asked to, increase that tax as well, right? That could be in the November ballot. So we didn't include that in our question yet, just it's not clear if the increase is going to be a part of it and stuff. So there's lots of things that could change, and certainly we think that could change support as well.
Thanks, Matt. Josh Peck, a question for Dr. Gervais.
Yeah, Dr. Gervais, thanks for doing this. I had a question about the mayor's poll, which is, are you familiar or do you have a sense of other cities that have an open mayor's race like this? How common it is for it to be this wide open at this point? Is this, pretty regular, or are there just so many candidates and that maybe that's part of why people just don't know who they're going to vote for yet?
Well, I read a couple pieces from some reporters here on just the low threshold it takes to get on the ballot here in San Antonio, and so that's part of it, right? Is structural reasons, and that we have so many candidates this time around. We've also had changes in compensation for not just mayor but also city council. That I think probably makes the position more attractive to a larger range of folks than it was previously. We go through, recent history, and it's been a while since we've had a, truly wide open or an open race like this, and so, it's, I think all those things probably contribute to the pretty large amount of people throwing their hat in the ring this time around.
Right. Thank you, Josh. Molly Smith, good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to ask you about the questions regarding Project Marvel.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you got a sense when surveying respondents of how much information they actually have about the project, and whether support for the project coincided with knowledge of it, or if there was a way for you to gauge in your questioning of how much they're aware or familiar with the plan.
No, we didn't do that. Didn't gauge prior familiarity with Project Marvel. Sometimes that's something we've done in the past, which is we ask people ahead of time, are you familiar with this? Yes or no. This time around, I think just because of the widespread use of the code name Project Marvel, we thought it best to describe what Project Marvel entails, and then say, do you support this project, yes or no? But I think it's a really good question, right? Does prior knowledge of Project Marvel, do we see a big difference there in level of support? And I'm not quite sure how that would work out, right? It might be that people who are paying more attention are more supportive, or they could be less supportive. I'm not really sure. So that's an interesting thing, and maybe something we'll explore in the future.
Thank you. Up next, Megan Stringer. Hello.
Hi. I'm just wanting to talk a little bit more about how it was weighted in terms of the voters who were included or not.
Yeah, sure. I could pull up slides too if you want me to go through this. I'll give you a fair warning. It's a little bit getting into the weeds and stuff. But we start by and this is our approach we've always done with most of we've done with all our voter polls, is that we divide people into three groups, and it's all based on past voting history. So in this case, imagine we've had three groups. We have people who were registered and they voted in the May 2023 mayoral election, so the last mayoral election. People who were registered but did not vote in the May 23 election, and we call abstainers. And then we have new registrants, people who were registered to vote, who have registered to vote since the May 2023 election. So we don't have any prior history of their participation in mayoral elections. So we put people into these three groups, and then we want to know, okay, to what extent do people from these three groups, what are their likely chance that they vote in the May 2025 election. And we estimate that by looking at how these groups have voted historically in San Antonio mayoral elections, right? And so we'll look at, okay, how many people who voted, let's say, in the 2017 mayoral election, then came back to vote again in 2019? How many people who abstained in 2017 came back and then voted in 2019? And then how many people who were new registrants in 2019 actually turned out to vote? And we do this for a number of mayoral elections, and we produce something that's called, we call our weighted average turnout rate for each of these three groups. So then what we do, and let me be clear here that these numbers are all example numbers. I'm just for brevity purposes and other purposes. I don't have, these aren't the actual numbers that we use here. Let's suppose that we had the number of registered voters in San Antonio was 1 million. It's not exactly that. And we see that once we categorize people into those three categories, we see that 170,000 of them were voters in 23. 700,000 were abstainers in 23, and 130,000 were new registrants. And then we see the historic turnout numbers. 70% of voters tend to vote in the subsequent mayoral election. 8% of abstainers will vote in the following election, and 4% new registrants turnout. So then that allows us to produce an estimated count when we multiply those numbers, and we can get an estimated count of what we expect the next electorate to look like. And that's what we see here. 119,000 voters will turn out, 56,000 abstainers, 5,600 new registrants. And so that allows us to determine the share of the sample that we're going to draw for these groups. So we randomly draw from each of these groups the proportions we see here. So 66%, we're randomly drawing from the voter group, 31% from the abstainers, and 3% for the new registrants. You're probably regretting that you asked me this question at this point, but I'm going to finish up. What we then do is, after we fielded the survey, we go back and look, and we see, okay, well, did the people respond to the survey? Do we get the proportions we want, or did we see, let's say, people who are voters responded to our survey more than we'd like, right? And so we do post-stratification weighting, where we weight again on those proportions that I just went over to make sure our group matches what we want. And then we also have self-reported likelihood of voting questions in the survey itself. And what we do here is we weight on this variable. We exclude, again, people who report they're not likely to vote at all, and weight it so that it's predominantly made up of people who say they're extremely likely and very likely to vote in the May election. And that's how we produce the likely voter sample. With that, I'll stop going on. I hope that makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gervais. Matt Roy, you had another question?
Yes, and it's more on those lines, so you might need to pop out the slides again. But I wanted to ask about the sample size. Is 683, I believe, was the number that you guys included in this one. Is that large enough to truly gauge or have a litmus test on all of these issues? Do you guys feel that was a significant enough number to do this?
Yeah, it's par for the course. So, I mean, the rule of thumb that the industry has long held is that you want a margin of error of 4.0 or less, right? And so that's always going to be 600, and it's 600. And so we aim, we usually cut it off once we're approaching 700 and stuff. So, we usually say, okay, once we've achieved 600 participants, we got that margin of error for the poll that's going to be 4.0. Anything beyond that is gravy. And then, we got to cut it off at some point, do the analysis and get the results out there and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, we got 683 it was really within 3 days, not even a full 4. So we're really happy with that response. And very happy with that number, and that's sort of typical. All right, 683, 700, 600, 700 is what you probably normally see in lots of municipal election polls.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Matt. Molly Smith, you had another question?
Yeah, I'm curious whether in future polls you'll ask, when you ask about Project Marvel, whether you'll put any of the cost estimates on it. I know the poll was in the field about a week before the city came out with some of their estimates for like Spurs Arena, the convention center expansion. So curious whether those will factor in to future questions.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think we'll sit down and talk about that and what new details we want to include, how much we want to change up the question. But I think that makes some sense to provide voters with that information as well. We want to try to make the questions as balanced as possible. But I think in that case, including the cost estimate, probably isn't putting or making the project seem too bad or anything along those lines, or biasing the results all that much. So yeah, I think we'll consider doing that.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Looks like we may be towards the end of those. Want to give you all one last chance. And while we wait to see that, just a reminder that you should all have received the news release and background material from UTSA and the Center for Public Opinion Research. I don't see any more questions coming up here. So if you have any additional inquiries, need more information, additional backup from Dr. Gervais, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to assist you. And we thank you all very much for being here today. We look forward to reporting back to you after the next poll is in the field later this spring. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Gervais.
Thank you.